My thanks to Simon Goldhill, to Peter DeBola, the staff and fellows of CRASSH, and my colleagues in the Experimental Concept Lab for a very intense first month of my Leverhulme visit. This lecture is itself a form of thanks, for it explores the conditions of possibility for a center that seeks to reconnect the arts, social sciences, and humanities. The first condition is, of course, the division of knowledge into those categories, with their second-order divisions into the narrow but deep disciplines of modernity. The second condition is the sense that there's something to gain by this reconnect, that knowledge needs it now. That thought, that whatever our individual interests, we all share the historically rare opportunity to rework the organization of knowledge itself, is also the inspiration for the Enlightenment project. It casts that opportunity as a question about the relationship of the future to the past. What can and should we do with the legacy of Enlightenment? As that inheritance from our modern universities and museums to our clubs and protocols feels the pressure of gradual and sudden changes in finance, society, and technology, it's up to us to shape the result. The Enlightenment work I do with Pete and an international collaboratory inside and outside of academia foregrounds three touchstones: past and present, mediating technologies, and connectivities. My talk today is paced by those touchstones. I'll begin by linking past and present, a microbiologist's experience of knowledge being stuck today, with Galileo's and Bacon's efforts to advance knowledge through the building of new tools. I then follow the trajectories of those tools into the Enlightenment and to that moment in the late 18th century when a new organization of knowledge, disciplinarity, emerged from it. To explore this moment of disconnect, to understand why and how it happened, and thus why we need CRASSH and the project today, I will debut a beta version of a new tool, a product of what Bacon would call our technological, quote, good fortune. I'll then end by doing some fortune telling as I look forward to the possibilities for scaling up to new connectivities in the sciences and the humanities. At first glance, Francis Bacon's experience of knowledge being stuck appears quite straightforward. He looked to his new resources as the solution to what he saw as scholasticism's dead end. The new organon would replace the old organon, the Aristotelian knowledge that had, quote, stalled. But knowledge, like cars, can stall out for very different reasons. Our new resources, the electronic, the digital, the algorithmic, have changed so much so fast that they've left us facing not a dead end, but its opposite, and opening out into a kind of epistemological vertigo that leaves us frozen at the edge. Our good fortune has been so good that it has extended not only what is known, but here's the sticky part, what I will call knowable space. Even for the most adventurous among us, the problem lies in how to know what's now newly knowable. Let me illustrate what's at stake in this distinction. In one of the many conversations that went into building the Enlightenment project, the pioneering microbiologist Carl Nathan described to me the frustrating state of knowledge in his field, a field rather gothically described on his website as figuring out, quote, how macrophages kill, how killing is regulated, and why killing is not always effective. On the one hand, chemoinformatics, the use of new information technologies to optimize the drug discovery process, has given Carl and his colleagues an extraordinary perspective on their area of inquiry. What they call chemical space, an imaginary descriptive realm containing all of the molecules they could in principle create, is now understood to be almost unimaginably large, 10 to the 69th possibilities. But on the other hand, only a minuscule fraction of that space has been explored, or, he emphasized, is likely to be explored anytime soon. We don't know how to do it, and our current tools, methodologies, institutions, and economies are now, according to Carl, not only not helpful, but in the way. Knowledge in a field that those of us outside it think is advancing like crazy is actually stalled. Where is new knowledge in this scenario? The scaling up of knowable space to 10 to the 69th possibilities is not in itself new, but the result of our old, what we call settled knowledge, revealing to us our own limitations. It is in our inability to navigate that space, to go to scale, that the opportunities for truly new knowledge lie. So let's begin this venture by turning back to an earlier act of scaling up, of navigating the knowable space of space itself, a realm expanded by the debut of a new tool 400 years ago. This is Galileo's Message from the Stars, published back in 1610 after his observations of what he discovered were the moons around Jupiter. The message delivered in 1610 was clear, quote, as clear as daylight, as Galileo explained after gazing into the night sky. Stars that he had believed to be fixed turned out to be, upon subsequent observation, moving around Jupiter. These three little stars, he, quote, decided unhesitatingly, were actually three moons. But that wasn't why Galileo decided to rush his new observations into print as, quote, an announcement to all philosophers and mathematicians. The discovery of new heavenly bodies was certainly exciting, but that wasn't the message. What mattered more than the bodies themselves was what they formed. Together with their home planet, these bodies constituted a system. And what was at stake for knowledge, knowledge of the, quote, true and physical constitution of the world, was not that this was the first, but the second such system that had been observed. To the Earth and its moon, Galileo had added a second system, and that made all the difference. It changed how the first was understood. If all heavenly bodies revolved around the Earth, then the moon was like the sun and the planets, just another part of a single and comprehensive system of the world. But seeing Jupiter as a system with its own moons cast the Earth and its moon in a different light. As a system unto themselves, the moon assumed a new status as the only body to revolve around the Earth. Copernicus, of course, had made that argument in 1543, but for 70 years the debate had stalled, sharing the same fate that Galileo's contemporary Francis Bacon declared for all knowledge. The sciences, Bacon complained, in arguments for advancement and restoration that chronologically bracketed Galileo's message, quote, are almost stopped in their tracks. They were stuck. Although some astronomers were attracted by its mathematics, heliocentrism failed to provoke even the official ire of the Earth through the remainder, of the Church, through the remainder of the 16th century. We're already personifying this planet. The basic reason for what looks to us like a puzzling delay was that accepting Copernicus's system meant opening up a host of questions to a need for entirely new explanations. If, for example, the Earth is a planet, why should it be the only planet with a moon? To discover that it was not the only one, Galileo realized, was to break the logjam, to acquire at last, quote, a notable and splendid argument to remove the scruples of those who can tolerate the revolution of the planets around the sun in the Copernican system, but are so disturbed by the motion of one moon around the Earth that they think this constitution of the universe must be rejected as impossible. That's Galileo. Sometimes being stuck means having no answers. Sometimes it means having answers, but not knowing what to do with them. At stake in this logjam over system was not just knowledge, but knowledge that was load-bearing, knowledge that made more and new kinds of knowledge possible. The translator's choice of splendid is thus not quite adequate to Galileo's Latin adjective for this argument. Placarum points to a specific kind of argument, one that brings clarity. This argument made new knowledge possible, preparing the way for the resolution of the revolution debate in Galileo's Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems 2 decades later, 1632, and almost a full century after Copernicus. How did Galileo do it? Most famously, he did it with his spyglass. But there was something else. That glass instrument made the stars, quote, manifest to his gaze. It showed them this, which he remediated into this. So if you can see this, it's a little fuzzy in here with the light. But these are his sketches of his nightly observations, through which he noticed that these supposedly fixed objects were actually moving around the large object, which is Jupiter. It was the second tool, however, that turned those observations into a message. It showed him this, and again, you have to look very carefully here, but the red, these are the 4 moons. He later discovered the 4th one. He only saw 3 at first. And then you can now see the blue, which turned out to be the other moons. And that, in fact, can be scaled up to this, and if you'll bear with me a second. Those are all the moons of Jupiter, and those turned out, to put it in another perspective, to put some scale on this, there's the sun, there's Jupiter with all the moons in there, going all the way out to Neptune, Pluto, etc. How did Galileo advance knowledge? He did it with the telescope, and he did it with these systems. That second tool shaped his observations into a message that confirmed Copernicus. Since more than one planet had a system, the message was that the system of the world was a world full of systems. Finding systems to be pervasive, both more of them and in places where they hadn't been observed before, raised possibilities for new knowledge. System had been in scholasticism's toolbox, but in Galileo's hands which also held an improved spyglass, it did double duty, both naming what was seen in the physical world and, crucially, turning it into a message. The Jovian lunar system became evidence for a new system of the world. As it doubled itself to perform both roles, system turned Aristotelian logic inside out, from a form of logical thinking into a method for thinking logically about the empirical world. Used in this way, system generated new knowledge while playing an instrumental role in forming our own epistemological practices. Today, we no longer even notice the doubling that allows us to speak of the telephone system as something that's both conceptual, a way to organize communications, and concrete, as a physical wired or wireless network that can go down. And since Galileo's discovery was a discovery of scale, a tale of lunar systems within larger systems, systems' etymological meaning, a setting up or standing together, also came into play. By foregrounding relationships between parts and wholes, system could do the work of scale, of what fits within what, both in terms of scaling up, wholes becoming parts of larger wholes, and scaling down. System became the genre of choice for writing up a universe inconceivable to those who were, in the words of Galileo excusing Aristotle for being wrong, simply not, quote, in possession of present-day sensory observations. By telling his tale as a tale of systems within systems, Galileo helped to scale up our knowledge of a universe made strange by, quote, marvelous discoveries. He was not alone. That same year in which Galileo found a system in deep space, 1610, is the exact same year the Oxford English Dictionary cites for the first appearance of the word system in English. By the 1630s, when Galileo published his World Systems Manifesto, system had become a descriptor for things of all kinds. As in the OED's second citing of system in 1638, quote, man's life is a system of diverse ages. The year is a system of 4 seasons. By the end of that century, the use of system was poised for takeoff. This diagram is based on the database 18th Century Collections Online, which is approaching about 300,000 texts from the 18th century. 1700 to 1800, these are the percentages of texts that contain system. Just linear, straight up. System, I argue in my new book, was the enabling form of enlightenment. By the mid-18th century, according to Samuel Johnson's dictionary definition, writers in the world of learning faced a simple binary choice. You write system or you write essay. My second Leverhulme lecture in April will detail how system secured that status by becoming the preferred form of guesswork in the new science and its Newtonian offshoots. But my focus here today is on the top right of this diagram. For those last 2 decades, 1780 to 1800, saw not only, as I observed earlier, the organization of knowledge into the modern disciplines that CRASSH is now rehousing, it also saw a collision, what I will call a tectonic collision, between system and another genre. That genre was history. My argument is that their intersection helps to explain the formation of the division of knowledge we call disciplinarity. Why history? If we retrace the upward trajectory of system back to its Galilean launch, we find that history became a genre of special interest at exactly the same time and for the same reason, to get knowledge going again. When within a few years of Galileo's message, Francis Bacon described his plan for advancing knowledge, he did not claim to be smarter or better than his predecessors. As with Galileo excusing Aristotle, ancients versus moderns was not a contest for Bacon, but history. A history that told of what he called his good fortune in living in a moment of different, quote, resources than they did. The resources that he cited were mechanical things, printing, gunpowder, and the nautical compass. But Bacon recognized how easy it would be to squander those resources, so he warned against the idols of the mind and argued for the importance of method, which he also spoke of as a machine. Most importantly, however, Bacon argued that no single mind, contra Descartes, could advance knowledge on its own. The great instauration was collaborative to its core. Knowledge was stuck, Bacon argued, and we can only move it forward together. His major publications were more than monuments to himself and his own ideas. They were basically grant proposals, requests for funding for large-scale projects complete with appendices detailing tasks and timelines. That's why the Royal Society considered him its founding father in a much more literal sense than we usually acknowledge. The members were not just honoring him as a great thinker, but as the architect of the architect of the scientific institution as the social institution they now formed. Their society was the embodiment of his vision of new knowledge as necessarily a joint undertaking. Appealing to the powerful and the wealthy for support is not, of course, unusual, neither back then nor now. Bacon's particular request to King James, however, took the form of a very specific and unusual proposal. It asks him to take, quote, steps to ensure that a natural and experimental history be built up and completed. What's strange here is that Bacon does not want help building something like a building, but building a genre. And that's what he asks for from the first page of his proposal to the last. In fact, the 1620 Organon ends with an extraordinary list of all that needs to be done, a list that bears the now telltale signs of a PI facing an imminent deadline. And now should come the delineation of the particular histories. But I have at present so many other things to do that I can only find time to subjoin a catalog of their titles. I've just picked out from the list. This list goes on to 130 histories that have to be written, from the history of comets, the history of rainbows, the history of jugglers and mountebanks, the history of salts, etc. Why history, and why so many of them? As shown by my turn to Galileo, system only became, to use Walter Ong's word, interesting, when it became plural. Initially, when Copernicus pitted his new system against the established one. It became, to use Galileo's own word, quote, really interesting, when systems started showing up inside of each other. The same is true of history, as forcefully illustrated in Pomada and Sarassi's Historia, Empiricism and Erudition in early modern Europe. Recovering the history of history, this volume shows history to consist historically of different kinds with different functions. History, that is a genre that, like all genres, is a mixture of features and functions that change over time. Whereas systems setting up of parts and wholes could, as we have seen, structurally serve those priorities, history had what Donald R. Kelly calls, quote, a detachment from form and structure that did not lend itself to the new organon. Galileo highlighted that issue by pointedly contrasting philosophers like himself to, quote, historians who relied on textual authority. That distance from form and structure did, however, afford history the flexibility to take on a variety of different tasks. In 1613, just 3 years after systems' debut in English, the Lexicon Philosophicum offered a fourfold definition of history. At the root of that multiplicity was a polarity of purpose with deep roots in the classical enterprise of Historia, the distinction between things and time. Pomada and Sarassi's collection tracks how this distinction plays out in the genre's shifting mix of the empirical and the chronological. It demonstrates in detail that it was not until the late 18th century that temporality moved to the core of history. Many kinds of histories were simply not concerned with the passage of time. Here, for example, is Encyclopedia Britannica's definition of history in 1771. History, a description or recital of things as they are or have been, in a continued orderly narration of the principal facts and circumstances thereof. Notice that the have been, the past, is only an option. The overall focus is on what we would call the empirical, things as they are. Bacon foregrounded that phrase as a key to his plan to advance knowledge, for it invoked for him the empirical as the historical. That's why Bacon claimed that his advancement into a future of new knowledge, quote, must only be made by a natural history, and that of a new kind. System and history, then, were launched at the same time to address the same problem, how to pull out of a stall and scale up to the good fortune of new resources. But recovering what happened next and the consequences is no easy task. So it's time to turn on our new tool. I call the diagrams about to appear on the screen tectonic maps, for the different shapes in each map resemble the plates that float on the surface of the Earth. These shapes, although irregular, fit together, should I be saying crashing together, into what geologists would call a Pangea or supercontinent. The analogy is, of course, only a starting point for grasping what the maps represent and what they can do for us. Take a look at the first one. Let me go for a second, just right through. Just watch the red. This map is the product of my collaboration with my research colleague, Mark Algie Hewitt, who in building it has drawn on work in information visualization at Bell Laboratories. Tectonics is, as I mentioned earlier, in beta, which means the technology will get better and the maps much, much prettier and more significant, and most importantly, like all new technologies, it will take time for it to take hold, for you and I and it to find its primary forms and functions. Based on all of the title pages in ECHO, 18th century collections online, that contain variations of the word system, it tells us which other words also appear on those title pages. Each word receives a distance score from every other word, based on the likelihood or probability that both would appear within the same title. These are stem searches, meaning that they catch all variants of the word, with one exception. Since our focus is on the relationship of history to system, we have given history special attention. Its variants occupy two plates. One, as with system, is the noun, both singular and plural. The other is for the modifiers, historical and historically. And on this first map, they don't make the map. I'll explain. Every plate is bounded by the words with which it most often shares title pages with system. The diagrams thus map both adjacencies and clusters. Having system as the common denominator at the center of the map translates the frequency with which words share title pages with system into distance from the center. Think of these word plates as radiating from system like spokes from a hub. As the date ranges change from map to map, moving sequentially through the 18th century, we can track which words and clusters in the descriptive title pages of that time fall in and out of proximity with system. In the first 4 decades of the 18th century, as mapped here, we find history in its plural at the periphery. System is surrounded more closely by terms associated with Newtonian natural philosophy, including nature, account, method, universe, observation, and matter, table, and body. Although at a further distance, even Newton's, we can call them nameplates, make it onto the map. Sir Isaac Newton. In the next third of the century, however, they fall off the edge into the mouth not of a monster, but of statistical insignificance. And a number of the Newtonian terms give way to a new set of systems that package knowledge into a variety of introductory accounts and descriptions that include illustrations and copperplate engravings. As this surge in systems that, quote, illustrate knowledge, contributed to what John Bender and Michael Merriman describe as the culture of diagram, history was also on the move. In this slice of the 18th century, 1740 to 1779, it halved its earlier distance from the center, approaching system in the company of a new set of terms. History, when sharing title pages with system, increasingly took on the task of, quote, showing things, particularly things that were, quote, curious or more, quote, accurate. What happened next, in the final 2 decades of the 18th century, is what I am calling the collision. Could this have been predicted? Predicted in the manner that geologists are working hard to predict earthquakes today? What we can say is that system and history shared an initial push and direction, a trajectory, from Galileo's and Bacon's contemporaneous efforts to advance knowledge. And that after the advancement we call Enlightenment, their trajectories intersected. What tectonics does is materialize that intersection on a broad evidentiary base that in its specificity and physicality, 2,679 different title pages, can help us to understand better what happened and why. It offers, for example, an index to the force of that collision in the form of historical, appearing now on the map for the first time, an indication that the adjectival and adverbial constructions also now share more title pages with system in what we might call the generic modifier format, as in historical systems. By mapping adjacencies, tectonics also identifies and visualizes the conditions of possibility for new forms of knowledge and understanding. In this case, the meeting or collision of system and history formed what I would now term a platform, a generic platform, on which knowledge could and did divide into the modern disciplines. Tectonics is, per Galileo, a new spyglass for zooming in, for charting spatially over time the shifting adjacencies that enable larger scale change, including the reorganization of knowledge, and for Pete's work on concepts in the experimental lab we are running together at CRASSH, the formation of new concepts. Calling this method of materializing change tectonics points as well to this sharing of an edge as an act of building, the term's etymological root. A tectonic form, as in an OED site from 1903, quote, a form produced by the exigencies of construction. Thus, another payoff for tectonics as a tool of re-enlightenment is that it can help us to understand what's being built and under what conditions. What were the exigencies that drove history into system and onto shared title pages? We focused the third map on just the last 2 decades of the 18th century because of 2 quantitative phenomena of that period of time: the overall takeoff in print and the increase in standalone, self-proclaimed systems as vehicles for specialization and professionalization. And in the book, I detail these numbers. For example, a system of the income tax, a system of education. In this growing and thus more and more crowded market for print, all kinds were under increasing pressure to lay claim to their part of it. Even the most comprehensive categories assumed more specialized forms. Specialization, however, was not a simple matter of isolation, but of renegotiating boundaries and functions with other forms. History's interaction with system was just such a negotiation, the terms of which we can find inscribed on the title pages identified by our tectonic maps. By scaling up to thousands of title pages, those maps also allow us to scale down, to zoom into specific examples of this new adjacency. We can see that under the pressure of those final decades, system and history, to use a word from one of the title pages I will now show, entered into a, quote, gratifying relationship. For Mrs. Dard's catalog, on the one hand, on your left, the gratification comes from a, quote, new system interrelating with, quote, history by appealing to history's empirical mode of valuing, quote, objects minutely described. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, Thomas Banks', quote, new and authentic system of 1788 is enhanced by, quote, complete history in its chronological mode of accounting for events that, quote, have taken place. That temporal dimension provides system with the opportunity to exercise its scalability across time as well as space. For with the past mixed in, Banks' system becomes a new, quote, whole, comprehending, quote, everything worthy of notice throughout the whole face of nature, both by land and water. As history met system under the exigencies of those last 2 decades, the 2 genres rebuilt each other, and in the process reshaped other subject areas from branches of philosophy into standalone specialties. Both of these shared title pages announce such specialized systems of biology and of geography, both of them becoming part of systems' end-of-century surge and of knowledge's new shape. In Galilean terms, there were more systems within systems. In turn, systems' scalability, its capacity to scale up to the, quote, universal for Banks, and to a, quote, variety that was equal to nature for Mrs. Dard's, opened new realms for the professing of history. Under the competitive exigencies that helped to specialize and professionalize system, more systematic histories took on more, with more becoming the mark of its changing status. Per Banks' geography, history met the agenda Bacon had set for it. It scaled up, that is, to the, quote, whole world, mounting new efforts at world and universal history that extended and rationalized earlier biblical and monarchical chronologies. A century after Newton had used a universal law of rising and falling to give a new coherence to the system of the world, Edward Gibbon wrote A History of the Decline and Fall, 1776 to 88, and Alexander Tytler published a plan for a universal history, ancient and modern, 1782. With system now mediating the empirical connection to things, absolving history of that function, this was the moment in which temporality finally completed its move to history's core, to become what we think of as history. New knowledge groupings now had empirical content, arranged systematically, and their own chronological narratives to define them and to differentiate them from each other. And they also now had professionals specializing in the writing and recitation of those narratives. Both Gibbon and Tytler were professors, and Tytler's plan was for a, quote, course of lectures. To corroborate the phenomenon I have just described, the tectonic formation of the narrow but deep disciplines of modernity at the late 18th century intersection of history and system, we need to be able to observe it from a different generic standpoint. The perspective that offers the greatest clarity is not surprisingly from one of the most prominent and proliferating genres of those final decades of the 18th century, the Encyclopedia. When the first edition of Encyclopedia Britannica appeared in 1768 to 71, its editor explicitly denounced previous forms of organizing knowledge in alphabetical order and in comprehensive diagrams of all knowledge as, quote, repugnant folly. So that's putting down Chambers, putting down the French Encyclopedia, etc. Materials from all of the sciences and arts were instead, quote, digested into substantial, quote, treatises or systems that proved to be Britannica's most striking and consequential formal innovation. The consolidation of alphabetically organized material into an array of subject-specific, quote, arrangements that anticipated the modern curriculum. In effect, the Encyclopedia became the home of proto-disciplinary systems. That is, the first version's nascent disciplinarity. As Britannica grew during the decades of the takeoff in print, almost quadrupling from 2,391 pages in the 1771 first edition to 8,595 in the 1784 second edition, and then almost doubling again into the 14,579 pages of the third, more produced difference. Not only did the number of proto-disciplines increase with the number of pages, but their boundaries, the boundaries between them, thickened. What had been only digested was now defined and deepened. By the third edition, each of these, quote, distinct new systems was now packaged, proclaimed the title page of the third edition, with its own, quote, history, theory, and practice. This move sounds innocuous until tectonics helps us to visualize what's at stake. When finally packed together at the end of the century, system and history formed a new generic platform, a platform on which the encyclopedia's new knowledge groupings could institute their differences by telling their own tales. Britannica could now claim that it contained, quote, full explanations of the, quote, various detached parts of knowledge. What Galileo observed in the stars, that the system of the physical world was a world full of systems, the reader of Britannica could observe on the page. The system of the intellectual world was becoming, edition by edition, a world full of new systems that are now our disciplinary homes. The fact that many of us today have second or even third homes in new locations of knowledge, like CRASSH and the Enlightenment project, tells us that 200 years after history met system, it may be time to regroup. Once again, knowledge is stuck, or at least feeling sticky. Going to scale, per Carl Nathan, has become a problem, I would argue, in every discipline, and thus I posit a problem in disciplinarity itself. Let me illustrate by comparing the situations in the humanities and biology. The English department, my disciplinary home, first emerged in Britain in the early 19th century. In fact, this year, 2013, is the 200th anniversary of the English department. A label first used in 1813 and referring to an entity in a school, not in a university. It emerged in the context of an abrupt and startling proliferation of print, the takeoff I mentioned earlier. The function of this new organizational grouping was to facilitate that transformation. English departments mediated society's relationship with the newly mature technology that now saturated it. Anthologies, the canon, the aesthetics of taste, interpretative close reading, and other now familiar features of English were the means to that end, not, in a longer view, ends in themselves. Those of us in English who take them as ends, as defining what we do to the exclusion of what mediation might also entail now, when we do that, we lose sight of our original purpose. How then can we take a more inclusive view, one that recognizes the ongoing value of what we do now and looks to the future? How can we zoom out to discover what we are all in? What kind of frame can embrace what we do and might do? I emphasize now because, as with chemical space, our knowable space in literary studies is changing shape, both deepening into searchable but growing databases of historical and current materials like ECHO, and extending across the globe and into and through new technologies. To dramatize what's at stake in this dramatic shift of scale, let's conclude by going out together on a limb. Actually, let's call it a branch. For my model, here is the man who won a Nobel Prize for establishing that there are three basic branches to the tree of life. Instead of resting on his personal laurels and the recent prominence of biology among the sciences, however, Carl Woese spent his 7th and part of an 8th decade, sadly he died just this past December, mounting a campaign in scholarly articles and magazine interviews to rescale his field. Declaring the obsolescence of reductionist biology in the very moment of its apparent success, he has been arguing, in the physicist Freeman Dyson's words, for, quote, the need for a new synthetic biology based on emergent patterns of organization rather than on genes and molecules. Woese's enabling strategy is to return to the usual suspect in arguing about biology, Darwin, but not just to take side in the debate that still concerns all of us, inside and outside the field, the debate between evolution and creationism. Instead, he zooms out, propelled by the simple but surprising observation that Darwinian evolution is only a chapter in the book of life. We forget that Darwin wrote about the origin of species, not the origin of life. The age of Darwinian speciation, roughly 2 to 3 billion years, may seem long to us, but it was but an interlude within the larger history of living things. What preceded it was a period without species that Dyson has summarized in often hilarious terms. Quote, life was then a community of cells of various kinds sharing their genetic information. Evolution could be rapid as new chemical devices could be evolved simultaneously through horizontal gene transfer. But then, one evil day, a cell resembling a primitive bacterium happened to find itself one jump ahead of its neighbors in efficiency. That cell separated itself from the community and refused to share. Its offspring became the first species of bacteria, reserving their intellectual property for their own private use. Once vertical gene transfer, how species do it, replaced horizontal gene transfer, evolution slowed down. For individual species, once established, evolve very little. In Darwinian evolution, established species have, quote, to become extinct so that new species can replace them. Strangely enough, that imperative sealed the fate of Darwin's epic. It began to end in Dyson's account of Woe's argument, quote, when a single species, Homo sapiens, began to dominate and reorganize the biosphere. Now, as Homo sapiens domesticates the new biotechnology, we're reviving the ancient pre-Darwinian practice of horizontal gene transfer, moving genes easily from microbes to plants and animals, blurring the boundaries between species. The evolution of life will once again be communal, as it was in the good old days before separate species and intellectual property were invented. So while everyone else thinks that they are in on the big argument, the truth of Darwinian evolution, Woese puts that concept, and thus the controversy, in its historical place. He did so by re-hierarchizing our histories. The history of life includes the history of species. Sound familiar? This was precisely Bacon's strategy for building the new organon. As we have seen, he hierarchized his histories. Natural and experimental history included all of the others, all 130 of them, just as Galileo's systems included other systems. Advancing knowledge was and is an exercise in scalability. As I've just argued, my disciplinary home, the English department, emerged as a solution to an earlier problem of scale, the scaling up of the sheer volume of print in late 18th century Britain. The problem that solution faces now is again a matter of scale, this time the scaling up of technologies other than print. That's no easy task, and for a simple reason. Those departments mediated the scaling up of print by scaling down. All of our expertise has developed as forms for manipulating scale. Close reading is the most familiar example. With the best of intentions and with, let me emphasize, very useful results, we teach our students to follow in our footsteps, to move in closer to the text, and for a very simple reason, to make more of it. The further we have burrowed in, sacralizing a few texts, isolating each word, dwelling on each image, the more we have had to say. Canonization, the vector of less, and close reading, the vector of more, are the paradoxical but robustly productive counter-movements of the modern literary system. We miss this paradox of scale when we misread our Google screens and think of our current age as an age of overload, of too much information. What a strange cliche that is, for it turns the past into the age of just the right amount. A strange notion indeed, rather than the age in which we can now see that relative scarcity was leveraged by the economies of disciplinarity into more. The question posed by Galileo and Bacon, Nathan and Woese is whether it is time once again to scale up to the knowable spaces made manifest by new tools. Today's new tools mean that it is Woe's time for all of the disciplines that emerged at the tectonic moment I have just described. To plot a future for what we do, we need a rubric adequate to our past, and as with Woe's, the recovery of a longer past can provide a clue. If, for example, those of us in literary study take this 200th anniversary of the English department as an occasion to turn back another 200 years earlier to Bacon, we will find that he was particularly worried in the advancement of learning about one particular kind of history being particularly deficient. His actual name for that history, and I can't tell you how happy I was when I found this, was literary history. The history of the literary in its formally broad sense of all learning. This, quote, story of learning would track, quote, the kinds of learning and arts that have flourished and decayed in various parts of the world at various times, in order, quote, to make men wise in the use and administration of knowledge. To scale up now, we need this new genre, this atlas, this handbook to how it happened and did not happen in the past. Without it, Bacon warns, quote, the history of the world seemeth to me to be as the statue of Polyphemus with his eye out, that part being wanting, which doth most show the spirit and life of the person. This is certainly a worthy goal for my discipline, a scaling up that could make full use of our skills in letters and in genres. But this is an enterprise for many persons and for all of the disciplines. It requires centers and projects and new tools, tools that can convey messages across our knowable spaces, messages from the stars and messages from the shifting terrains of tectonics. Thank you.